Hi, and welcome back to the Anástasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry. My name is Mako Nagasawa. Today, we'll be going back into the theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Today's topic is human beings as light bearers. This is a wonderful, wonderful theme. This session rounds out the section on salvation, the defeat of evil, because in the last two sessions, we looked at the addictive power of evil. We looked at salvation, atonement, and the defeat of evil. And now we'll kind of round out the other side of things and look at what does it mean to be filled with light. And just briefly, we looked at in session one, Tolkien's purpose in writing is to create a story that demonstrates his love for languages. Number two is to reconstruct a myth for England, including to some degree, what languages and words might have existed back then. What type of story was that? And number three, to reconstruct a little bit of why the English people came into Christian faith. What was it that they might have believed before Christian faith arrived that prepared them for it? And so we looked at the character of God in the Lord of the Rings, because there are some very interesting and beautiful similarities between the portrayal of God in Scripture and the portrayal of God in the Lord of the Rings and the whole legendarium, which would include the Hobbit and the Silmarillion. We looked at the role of humanity, and last time we looked at the relationship between good and evil, and how is it possible for good to defeat evil. As that happens, human beings in Tolkien stories become light bearers as humans participate in the good triumphing over evil. That is what happens. And we're going to begin with a passage from Aragorn's story. So this is from the Two Towers. And this is one of my favorites. This is Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas encountering the riders of Rohan. And this is one of the first times where Aragorn discloses himself and his identity as king. And it is so powerful. And watch what happens when Legolas kind of sees a foresight and a premonition of Aragorn bearing light as on his head like a crown. Aragorn says, "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and am called Elessar, the Elfstone, Dunedain, the heir of Isildur, Elendil, son of Gondor. Here's the sword that was broken and is forged again. Will you aid me or thwart me? Choose swiftly." Gimli and Legolas looked at their companion in amazement, for they had not seen him in this mood before. He seemed to have grown in stature, while Éomer had shrunk, and in his living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of the kings of stone. For a moment, it seemed to the eyes of Legolas that a white flame flickered on the brows of Aragorn like a shining crown. That is a kind of premonition, because at the end of the story, when Aragorn is crowned king, there is a light that is about him. When Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood, and wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. Now, is that just a metaphor, or is there something deeper? I think there is a kind of light that emerges from within, from the characters, because we also see it in Frodo. Here's another scene in the Two Towers as Frodo and Sam are venturing nearer and nearer to Mordor, and Frodo is struggling mightily with the ring. He sleeps, and Sam sees a light coming through Frodo. He was reminded suddenly of Frodo as he had lain asleep in the house of Elrond after his deadly wound. Then, as he had kept watch, Sam had noticed that at times a light seemed to be shining faintly within, but now the light was even clearer and stronger. Frodo's face was peaceful. The marks of fear and care had left it, but it looked old, old and beautiful, as if the chiseling of the shaping years was now revealed in many fine lines that had before been hidden, though the identity of the face was not changed. Not that Sam Gamgee put it that way to himself. He shook his head, as if finding words useless. I want you to mark that Frodo's face is beautiful, because we will see faces that are lit with the light of transformation, of purification, of the struggle of good versus evil, described as beautiful. Here is one of those characters, Melian the Maya. And when she is encountered by Elwë Singolo, or later called Thingol, one of the kings of the Elves, he falls in love with her and the light that is in her face. Greatly though he had desired to see again the light of the trees in the face of Melian, he beheld the light of Aman as in an unclouded mirror, and in that light he was content. Beautiful love story. He had wanted to go back to Valinor and see the light of the trees again, but Melian was a Maya who had come from Valinor to Middle-earth. She had been in the presence of the trees. She herself is an incarnate angel, and she has the light in herself radiating, and that's something that Elwë looks at, loves, because he has loved it before, but it is now in the face of Melian. So they are married, and they get married, and they have a daughter named Luthien. Luthien also has a face with a shining light. And I'll read this because it's just so beautiful. Luthien was the most beautiful of all the children of Iluvatar. Blue was her raiment as the unclouded heaven, but her eyes were gray as the starlit evening. Her mantle was sewn with golden flowers, but her hair was dark as the shadows of twilight. As the light upon the leaves of trees, as the voice of clear waters, as the stars above the mists of the world, such was her glory and her loveliness, and in her face was a shining light. Now you might notice this raises a question in the legendarium of Tolkien. Is sharing in light a result of choices that people make? For example, it does seem like Aragorn and Frodo are making choices. It's their hope, it's their courage that brings about a light in their face. It's their struggle. Or is it just by birth? Obviously, Melian is of a different nature than elves and humans, and so you could kind of understand. But Luthien is born with a light shining in her face, it would seem, and other characters as well. Now, before we get into that, I want to explore how this has parallels in the biblical story. The most obvious parallel is Moses, when he climbs Mount Sinai and meets God face to face. Starting Exodus 19, in Exodus 34, Moses' face is described as shining forth the glory of God. There's something that happened to him such that his face was lit up. Exodus 34 reads this way: "It came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, and the two tables of the testimony were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him. So when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers in the congregation returned to them, and Moses spoke to them." So interesting. What does this mean? This doesn't seem to happen to many other characters in the Bible. But Moses does have this face-to-face encounter. And in many ways, this is held up as one of the most intimate moments that anyone has with God. The memory of this is preserved in a blessing that's repeated over and over in Jewish tradition and Christian tradition as well. It's recorded in Numbers 6, verses 24 to 27, where the face of God is invoked. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. So they shall invoke my name on the sons of Israel, and I then will bless them. So there's a yearning that's instilled in the deepest prayers and liturgies and creeds that we want that kind of encounter. Later, Jesus ascends a mountain and is transfigured. The idea here is definitely related to what Moses experienced, but Jesus takes it a step further. Matthew 17 describes it this way. 6 days later, Jesus, see, and even that's significant. So meaning this is the seventh day after something happened. And so 7 is a significant number in scripture. You can go chase that down. What is it that happened? And Jesus takes with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. A bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Amazing. What is this? Now, Irenaeus of Lyon reflects on this. Irenaeus is a 2nd century writer that Tolkien demonstrates a familiarity with. And he is one of many people from the early church that comments on this story of Jesus. Jesus came that all things might behold their King, and that the paternal light, or the light of God the Father, might meet with and rest upon the flesh of our Lord, and come to us from his resplendent flesh, and that thus man might attain to immortality, having been invested with the paternal light. Wow. So in other words, Jesus infused or invested his human nature with the light of God, the divine light, in order that we might participate in it. So what is Tolkien doing in portraying light this way, and our interaction, human interaction and elven interaction with this light? In the Silmarillion, there's a age of the trees in Valinor, which corresponds with the age of the stars in Middle Earth. And so the elves awaken under the stars. That's the first light they see. This is why they love Varda among all the Valar the most. They are discovered by Orome the hunter, and then discovered by the Valar as a whole. They're invited to Valinor and rescued from Melkor because he's already trying to undermine them. The elves get invited to Valinor. They behold the trees and the light of the trees, because the light of Eru Iluvatar comes through the Valar, and they invest the trees with that light, and that was the source of light. 3 houses of elves go to Valinor, but there are some elves that do not go, or either that or they were born after the trees. So the dark elves, or the Avari, are those those elves who are the unwilling, and they remain in the east, and they remain in Middle Earth. There is also the Sylvan elves and the green elves, and so this would include elves like Elrond and Arwen. They never saw the trees. Or Thranduil and Legolas had not seen the trees when we meet them in the Lord of the Rings. So there are certainly elves who had not gone yet. But the elves who did go and come back to tell the story, they seem to have internalized a light. So Galadriel, played in the Peter Jackson movies by Cate Blanchett, has a light in her eyes that are reflecting the light of the trees. And there was a special camera technique that was used so that you could see her eyes have an additional sparkle. Also, she puts the light of Earendil, which is really Venus, or the morning and evening star, into her vial and gives that to Frodo. So she is able to work with the light from the trees, maybe because she can put it in water, maybe because she has the ring of water, one of the 3 elven rings. Who knows? But there is some extra abilities that Galadriel has. So let's think a little bit about the Two Trees of Valinor. What are they? Well, they are important because they reflect the Valar's struggle against Melkor. They came after the lamps. So the first source of light were the stars, the second were the lamps, and then came the trees because Melkor knocked over the lamps. The remembering of the Two Trees of Valinor seems to be connected to this story, not just the light by itself physically, but the story of the Valar struggle against Melkor. And the reason why the Valar wanted there to be light was so that the children of Iluvatar would be cared for, would be able to flourish. And so all of these things are connected. Also, the Two Trees of Valinor are a reflection of the music of Eru standing against Melkor's dissonance. So the dissonant music that he wanted to inject into Arda. And this does help us answer the question, well, does sharing in the light happen by birth or by choice? Well, we see that the light can diminish in the figures of Melkor and Sauron, definitely, and Saruman also, because he loses the light, but also wraiths and other characters. They diminish, and they diminish in their share of the light. They become dominated by shadow or darkness. And so we could say that light can be shared in by birth, but it's also developed by choice. And there seem to be different kinds of qualities associated with the light of the two trees. Some are supernatural healing abilities, but others simply a moral character, like having a wisdom. For that reason, it's going to be really important for us to track what happens to the trees, the golden trees and the silver trees. So the first golden tree was Laurelin. It was made by Yavanna in Valinor and destroyed by Melkor. But Yavanna also made Malorn trees in Valinor. The elves spread them to the Lonely Isle, which is called Tol Eressëa, and then the elves gave some to the Númenóreans. One of the kings in Númenor, named Tar Aldarion, gave Gil-galad in Lindon Malorn seeds. And then Gil-galad, though he didn't plant the Malorns in Lindon, gave Galadriel a Malorn. And Galadriel planted it in Lothlorien and tended it. And then Galadriel gave Samwise Gamgee a Malorn seed for him to plant in the Shire. So there's the thread of golden trees. So hold on to that. We'll look at this, the white trees or the silver trees. Telperion was the first one. It was made by Yavanna and also destroyed by Melkor. Galathylion was a second white tree made by Yavanna. It didn't give off the light of Telperion, but it was made like Telperion. It was made in the image of Telperion. And she planted it in Tirion for the elves. Celeborn was the white tree that was planted in Tol Eressëa by the elves in the Lonely Isle. Nimloth the Fair was a sapling that was brought from Galathylion to the king's court in Númenor, and it was later, which was later destroyed by Sauron. So you could see the attacks of Sauron on the trees. Then we have the white tree of Minas Ithil. That came from Nimloth. It was a sapling, it was a fruit that Isildur stole from Nimloth before Sauron destroyed Nimloth. Then we have the white tree of Minas Anor, the city of the sun, which was a seedling that Isildur brought from Minas Ithil. That tree later died in the Great Plague. Then we have the white tree of Minas Tirith, where King Tarandor planted a seedling, which died in 2872. And finally, King Aragorn II brings a sapling back from a secret holy place, a hallowed path on Mount Mindoluin, which is the mountain that the city of Gondor was carved from. He finds it with the help of Gandalf and brings it back to the citadel. And so we thought all the white trees died, unlike the movie where there's one bloom left, the white tree in the courtyard comes into bloom again. In the books, Aragorn and Gandalf have to find a secret sapling that had been tended higher up in the mountain. Okay, so why are elves and men or humans somehow tied to the trees? Well, let's look at a little bit of the natures and destinies of elves and humans. So this is a quote from the Silmarillion. Immortal were the elves, and their wisdom waxed from age to age, and no sickness nor pestilence brought death to them. Their bodies indeed were of the stuff of earth, and could be destroyed, and in those days they were more like to the bodies of men, since they had not so long been inhabited by the fire of their spirit, which consumes them from within in the courses of time. But men were more frail, more easily slain by weapon or mischance, and less easily healed, subject to sickness and many ills, and they grew old and died. What may befall their spirits after death the elves know not. Some say that they too go to the halls of Mandos, but their place of waiting there is not that of the elves, and Mandos, under Iluvatar alone, save Manwë, knows whither they go after the time of recollection in those silent halls beside the outer sea. None have ever come back from the mansions of the dead, save only Beren, son of Barahir, whose hand had touched a Silmaril, but he never spoke afterward to mortal men. The fate of men after death, maybe, is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was all foretold in the music of the Ainur. So we get this statement about elves' nature first. There is a soul and body, or Fea and Hroa, where their bodies are the stuff of earth and their spirit is fire, or it is a type of fire. And over time, over the long years, the fire of their spirit consumes their body from within while they're in Middle Earth. And that's why they're supposed to depart to Valinor. If they stay in Middle Earth, they will feel the decline of Middle Earth and become world weary. So this is why most did leave to Valinor. And this is also Tolkien's very clever interpretation of why there are elven spirits in our world today, but disembodied. That kind of fuels the stuff of other myths, like elves as kind of fun-loving, capricious, blink and they're not there type of beings. Elves can die in Middle Earth, and if they die, for the most part, they're summoned to Mandos in Valinor, where they can be re-embodied if they choose. There are some really spectacular deaths of elves. Feanor and Fingon are both either wounded or slain in battle. Of Feanor, it said, so fiery was his spirit that as it sped, his body fell to ash and was borne away like smoke. So there's a fervency of Feanor's spirit. And in Fingon's case, he was hit in the head by a Balrog's axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Now, Melkor did corrupt some of the elves, and if they served Melkor, then they were vulnerable or maybe drawn to being counter-summoned by Melkor. And it said that Melkor put the Fear, the souls of some of the elves, into the bodies of beasts like Karkaroth the wolf and werewolves and vampires and so on. Oh, that just sounds terrifying. So for the elves, the reason why they would want to go to Valinor is to behold the light of the trees and to see what the beauty of Middle Earth is like when it is preserved. As far as Middle Earth goes, that is in decline, and so they become world weary. They are still bound to Arda one way or the other, and they have no knowledge of what awaits them after Arda. There's a chapter in Morgoth's Ring called the Athrabeth Fingon a Andreth, or the debate between Fingon and Andreth, which explores the relationship between the elves, what they hope for, what they know and what they hope for, and humans and what they know and what they hope for, and as it relates to renewal, restoration, resurrection even. And it is magnificent. But even in Valinor, they know that the beauty of Arda can only fade. Now, humans, on the other hand, are meant to be light bearers. They're meant to live by received wisdom, poems, physical representation of historical memory, like the trees. And they're meant to be students of the elves who were, students of the Valar, who were students of Eru Iluvatar. And so this is how Aragorn and Frodo become light bearers. They're vulnerable to temptation, though, and probably, they're prone to evil more than other races and species. The elves thought men were most like Melkor among all the Valar, and all the elves fought against Melkor, no matter what. They didn't necessarily agree with each other. They could be turned against each other. There were the kinslayings, but they all fought Melkor. Men, some of them actually sided with Melkor. So that is sobering. Now, in the case of humans, death was intended to be a gift of some sort from Eru, and we find that in multiple places. And of course, that is something humans wrestle with. Is it a gift? Why do we have to die? In what sense? Why can't we live longer? And so in the Athrabeth, Finrod and Andreth debate each other about whose fate is better. And what humans know, especially if you read the Children of Hurin, is that humans, unlike elves, are beckoned by a destiny beyond Arda alone. Men and women are called to depart Arda, and because of that, they have a freedom that even the elves don't have. I want to look at the ages of the sun, which follow the ages of the trees, or the age of the trees and the stars, and see how humans interact with light. And it is really, really fascinating. In the first age, men awaken, Morgoth begins to corrupt them or try to seduce them. And so they are discovered by the elves, like the elves were discovered by the Valar. The Valar didn't pursue humans. So men's origins are unknown. They're an eastern part of Middle-earth, which is named, but there's nothing known really about them. So I want to suggest that there's a fall story that's already implied. Something happened back then that we only get glimpses of. There are 3 houses of men who come west and oppose Morgoth, but there were more. There were others who remained. So, those 3 houses of men are Beor, Haleth, and Hador. They allied with the elves against Morgoth. But there were others, the Easterlings, Ulfang, later leads some Easterlings to betray the elves in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and they served Melkor instead. So they accepted a bribe from Melkor, and it is ugly. And in another story, one of the heroes, Turin, who slays Glaurung the dragon, still just makes these really sad choices and compares unfavorably to his cousin Tuor. Even though Turin is still heroic, there is an element of the fall that kind of runs through his story. Now, at the end of the first age, all the races come together to defeat Morgoth, and that's where the Eärendil and Elwing story comes in. They sail to Valinor, they plead for help, and the Valar come back to Middle-earth. They defeat Morgoth in the War of Wrath. Who are Eärendil and Elwing? Let's look at them a little more carefully, because they are light bearers. Eärendil is the son of Tuor, who is a male man, and Idril, a female elf. Who are they? Tuor came from all 3 houses of men who fought Melkor, and Idril came from the elven families of the Noldor and the Vanyar. So that's important. We will see Eärendil bring together all the houses of men and all the families of the elves. And it's important that Idril is described associated with light. Idril seemed to him as the sun, this is Maeglin, from which all the king's hall drew its light. So Eärendil's mother, Idril, is described with light. And Eärendil becomes a mariner. He has the sea longing, and he hopes that the Valar will come rescue Middle-earth. He's described this way: of surpassing beauty was Eärendil. Notice, Beauty, like Frodo, was described as beautiful. For light was in his face as the light of heaven, and he had the beauty and the wisdom of the Eldar, and the strength and the hardihood of the men of old. And the sea spoke ever in his ear and heart, even as with Tuor, his father. Elwing, his wife, was the daughter of Dior, who is a male man, and Nimloth, a female elf. And Dior was named Dior Aranel, the beautiful. Dior was the son of Beren and Luthien. And so Dior is a man, elf, and a Maya. So Beren comes from the house of Beor. Luthien comes from the Teleri king Thingol, and Melian the Maya. So that rounds out all three types of elves. She is named for starlight. She was named Elwing, which is star spray, for she was born on a night of stars, whose light glittered in the spray of the waterfall of Lanthir Lamath beside her father's house. In the Silmarillion, she's pursued. She saves the Silmaril, the last remaining Silmaril, which Beren and Luthien fought Morgoth for. She saves it in the dwarven Nauglamir by throwing herself into the sea when she is pursued by the sons of Feanor. But Ulmo, the Valar of the waters, rescues her and turns her into the shape of a bird. Here is that passage. This is so amazing when we are talking about these two as light bearers. Ulmo bore up Elwing out of the waves, and he gave her the likeness of a great white bird. And upon her breast there shone as a star the Silmaril, as she flew over the water to seek Eärendil, her beloved. On a time of night, Eärendil sat at the helm of his ship, saw her come towards him, as a white cloud exceeding swift beneath the moon, as a star over the sea moving in strange course, a pale flame on wings of storm. I think one of the places that Tolkien is drawing from literarily is Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God is hovering, brooding over the waters. And Deuteronomy 32, verse 11, rounds that out. The Spirit of God is hovering or brooding over Israel as the Spirit leads them into a garden land, a new garden land, just as the Spirit of God in Genesis 1 was brooding over all the waters to brood over creation until God can create humanity and place them in a garden land. And so the story of Israel is a retelling of the original creation. And there in Deuteronomy 32, the Spirit is described as a mother bird, hovering over her nest, protecting her young, extending her wings to protect them. The image of the Spirit as a cloud of light shaped like a bird with wings hovering over the waters, it's beautiful to imagine. Elwing is cast in that language. And it is sung that she fell from the air upon the timbers of Vingalot in a swoon, nigh unto death, for the urgency of her speed, and Eärendil took her to his bosom. But in the morning, with marveling eyes, he beheld his wife in her own form beside him, with her hair upon his face, and she slept. So the language there, I think, is reminiscent of the Spirit of God descending like a dove on Jesus in the waters of the Jordan River. There's some beautiful artwork capturing that. Eärendil is described in language that's a lot like Jesus. Eärendil climbed the green hill of Tuna and found it bare. So this is when he arrives in Valinor, and he entered into the streets of Tirion, and they were empty, and his heart was heavy, for he feared that some evil had come even to the blessed realm. He had arrived on a day where there's a festival, and so people were away. He walked in the deserted ways of Tirion, and notice what happens when he does that. And the dust upon his raiment and his shoes was a dust of diamonds, and he shone and glistened as he climbed the long white stairs. What's happening to him? He is being transfigured. He's being enlightened. And again, this is language like Moses climbing the mountain, or Jesus climbing the mountain and becoming transfigured, revealing divine light. When Eärendil gets there, he's confused. Why isn't anyone answering? And he called aloud in many tongues, both of elves and men, but there were none to answer him. Therefore he turned back at last towards the sea. But even as he took the shoreward road, one stood upon the hill and called to him in a great voice. This is Eonwe, the herald of Manwe, crying, Hail, Eärendil, of mariners most renowned, the looked for that cometh at unawares, the longed for that cometh beyond hope. Hail, Eärendil, bearer of light before the sun and moon, splendor of the children of earth, star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning. Notice again, Eärendil is bearing in himself all the houses of men who have fought Morgoth, all the families of the elves, and also the great craftsmanship of the dwarves in the Nauglamir that is bearing the Silmaril. So he comes really to represent all the children of the earth, and he's bearing light from the trees that existed before the sun and the moon, because in Tolkien's mythology, the sun and the moon were actually fruit from the trees. Spectacular description of Eärendil. And clearly both Eärendil and Elwing are portrayed as light bearers, both because they steward a Silmaril, but also because of their character and their hope. But one of the most poignant, touching, and amazing things about this story of Eärendil is that he can't return to Middle Earth. He, unlike Odysseus, who sailed home, rescued his wife and home and got to enjoy it and live there, at least in the telling of Homer, Eärendil sails away from home to rescue his home and can never return. And so that is the cost of a mortal stepping onto the undying lands. They took Vingalot and hallowed it, and bore it away through Valinor to the uttermost rim of the world, and there it passed through the door of night, and was lifted up even into the oceans of heaven. Now fair and marvelous was that vessel made, and it was filled with a wavering flame, pure and bright, and Eärendil the mariner sat at the helm, glistening with dust of elven gems, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow. This is Tolkien's myth of Venus and the star in the sky that shines the brightest. Far he journeyed in that ship, even into the starless voids, but most often he was seen at morning or at evening, glimmering in sunrise or sunset as he came back to Valinor from voyages beyond the confines of the world. So there's literary background to this. Obviously, again, Jesus in his transfiguration, but also ascension and enthronement, which is in Acts 1 and Revelation 1, are things in the background literarily.
There's also an association with a poem called Christ or Christ, the Ascension, by an 8th century Anglo-Saxon poet named Cynewulf. So let me explain that. Early Christians made an association between Jesus and the evening and morning star, which was really the planet Venus. Jesus says in Revelation 22, I am the morning star. You could look at the 2 Peter 1:19 reference that also speaks of the morning star rising in the hearts of believers. And so there's this association between what winds up being the planet Venus, considered to be a star at the time, and Jesus. Venus is the brightest star in the sky because it's the closest heavenly body to the planet Earth. It also is interesting because it follows the sun in the evening and rises before the sun in the morning. And so it becomes a sign or a symbol of Jesus dying and rising. Like he rises in the morning with hope, or signifying hope. And so Cynewulf, who again was an early Anglo-Saxon poet of the 9th century, write a poem in Old English, and I'll attempt to read it. My apologies to those who know better, but it is something that inspired Tolkien really deeply. It says, Ela Eärendil Engla Berthost offer Midengard monum sended, which translated means, behold, Eärendil of angels brightest, angel is just a generic term for messenger, and so it's referring to Jesus, of angels brightest, above middle earth unto men sent. Fascinating.
Tolkien stumbled upon this, and he wrote a poem called The Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star, in 1914, when he was 22 years old. And he says this: there was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind those words, if I could grasp it far beyond ancient English. This was what Christopher Tolkien, his son, called the first of the mythology. So this began his reflections on Eärendil, the light bearer, and Christ, the evening and morning star. But curiously, Tolkien doesn't tell us a lot of those stories. He refers to a lot of adventures that Eärendil had, but he doesn't tell it to us. Why is that? Perhaps it's because Tolkien is creating intentionally a parallel with other Germanic stories where there's a character that is referred to, and there supposedly adventures that he had, but we don't know what those adventures are. A scholar named Verlin Flieger gave a great talk called Waiting for Eärendil at the Tolkien Society annual conference in 2021. You could find that on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. Saying this was Tolkien's way of saying that there's a space or a gap. There are stories that have been lost, just as Tolkien himself was trying to fill in stories that had been lost. I love that. I would just propose that there's another layer to that there's a space that Tolkien is creating for more, that he's helping nurture in us as readers a hunger for a fuller story. Where are those stories of a light bearer? What's even more powerful about this is how central Eärendil and Elwing are as pivotal figures, not just in the first age, but in the second age and the third age. And I really have to credit Sean Marchese over at the Prancing Pony podcast for this insight. It's almost like there's an hourglass shape to the between the first and the second age, and you start wide and broad, and you kind of everything narrows down to Eärendil and Elwing. They're the pivot point, or the narrow point of the hourglass, and from there the second age broadens out, and their children are leading it. So what's the second age about? This is the war against Sauron. So who are their children? Well, Elrond and Elros. To Elros, the Valar give Numenor as a gift, because as a reward for humans fighting Morgoth. And Elros, half-elven, becomes its first king, gifted with longer life and wisdom, being able to look east and see the undying lands, and being able to receive from the elves there. Their other son, Elrond, goes to serve Gil-galad in Middle-earth and becomes a pivotal figure in the Lord of the Rings. There are some fall stories in the second age, like Sauron gives the 9 rings to Min, and Min fall into darkness. Sauron deceives many or most Numenorians to sail against Valinor, and Numenor gets flooded and sunk. But there's a remnant led by Elendil and his 2 sons, Isildur and Anarion. They come to Middle-earth, and eventually they form a last alliance of elves and men, and they defeat Sauron. However, there is a fall story. So Isildur fails to destroy the One Ring. He does bring a sapling of the white tree, though, to Middle-earth, and that begins this association between the line of kings and the white trees. But again, Eärendil's and Elwing's children are kind of center stage on the whole drama of the second age, as well as the third age. So the third age has to retell and redeem the second age because of the failure of Isildur to destroy the ring. All of this happens because of that. So what happens in the third age? The Dunedain maintain Gondor and Arnor for a while. Arnor is greater than Gondor. It's closer to Gil-galad and the elves. Isildur, king of Arnor, is killed by orcs, though. And then there are fall stories. Arnor is divided. between three brothers by civil war, eventually falls to the Witch King of Angmar. And then there are men that ally with Sauron, the Haradrim in the east, Dunlendings in Rohan through Saruman, and even Saruman becomes a traitor. Finally, men, elves, and dwarves defeat Smaug and then Sauron in The Hobbit and then Lord of the Rings. And in order to do that, Aragorn retells and redeems much of Isildur's story, and many, including Aragorn, retell aspects of Eärendil's story. So again, the theme of the retelling of stories, or Irenaeus's recapitulation, or what I would call healing atonement and medical substitution. The story needs to be retold. Atonement happens by a hero's journey, and the hero always inherits the conditions left to him or her by the fallen heroes or the villains, and makes the faithful choice. How do we see Eärendil, the light bearer? Frodo retold and reenacted Eärendil's story. How? In the sense that he also set out to save his home, but eventually had to lose it and leave it for others. And here's one of the most touching scenes in Return of the King between Sam and Frodo, where Frodo tells Sam that he needs to go to the Undying Lands to be healed for the last days of his life. It's not that he's going to be immortal, but what life he does have left, he can experience healing. But, said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too, for years and years after all you have done. So I thought too once. But I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir. All that I had and might have had, I leave to you. Oh, so good. We know that we were supposed to connect the dots back to Eärendil's story, because Sam even names it earlier in, I believe this is the Two Towers, as they were heading to Mordor. Sam realizes with a sense of wonder that they're living in that story. Sam talks about Beren and Luthien. Beren now, he never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown and Thangorodrim, and yet he did. And that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Eärendil. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of the light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end? No, they never end as tales, said Frodo. But the people in them come and go when their part's ended. Our part will end later or sooner. So why is there this parallel between Frodo and Eärendil? Well, let's think about that. In the First Age, Eärendil retold and redeemed Melkor's story and Feanor's story, right? I mean, the chief villains or tragic heroes of the First Age all grasped for the Silmarils, wanted them, tried to hold on to them, tried to keep them for themselves, manipulated everyone else in order to do that. Eärendil did the opposite. He inherited the Silmaril, but he used it for the sake of others. In the Second Age, Isildur reversed Eärendil's story by keeping Sauron's ring as a weregild, or that's Tolkien's term for a human or man price. Where is the Old English word for man? Guild was price, a man price for the death of his father Elendil. So basically, Isildur made the ring an heirloom and kept it. So of course that enabled Sauron to continue existing, and so in the Third Age, everyone had to retell and redeem aspects of Isildur's story. So they had to make the faithful choice even when he didn't. And they do so by retelling and reenacting aspects of Earendil's story. How do we see that? Well, so Gandalf gave up his life, and he was raised up as the White, meaning in the order of the wizards that he was more of a light bearer. He came with additional power. Galadriel gave the light of Eärendil in the File to Frodo. So in many ways, she was retelling Elwing's story, giving light to Frodo, who would have to bear the light into the darkness and try to make it. Aragorn's sword Andúril is linked to light, so is Frodo's sword Sting. Éowyn is linked to light, especially when she's introduced at Meduseld by the throne of Theoden, her uncle, but also especially when she fights the Witch King. When she stabs his face, her sword broke sparkling. There's imagery of light sparkling there. Frodo and Sam used the light of Eärendil in the darkness against Shelob. Aragorn as king bore the light on his brow, like Eärendil did. Frodo gave his life for his home, like Eärendil did, and eventually saw the light of Valinor too. All these characters have to retell and reenact aspects of Eärendil's and Elwing's story. When we come to the Fourth Age, where the main characters, which begin with Aragorn, Arwen, and the United Kingdom, you have the full transition to the Age of Men. You have the last of the Dunedain. Aragorn and Arwen are the last of those with the Elvish and Maiar blood and learning. They reestablish the Númenórean kings. They reunite the lines of Elros and Elrond, the children of Eärendil and Elwing. So there's a long genealogy at play. And it's not that they're first cousins. They're distant cousins, and they're reuniting the two houses. So that is a powerful retelling. Along with them, Faramir and Éowyn meet, fall in love, they get married, and they are students of the old lore and experience. So they will continue telling the stories and passing down the wisdom. And it's really important in that context that Faramir's love and heart and Éowyn's love and heart are identical, right? So when Faramir said, I don't love the sword, I love what it protects. And Éowyn says, I will no longer love just being a shield maiden or the stories of war. I will be a healer. I will guard him. That shift is a return to light. Aragorn plants the sapling of the white tree in Minas Tirith, and there's no more contact with elves. Big picture, what is Tolkien doing? I think he's creating an account of human history that can sit in certain gaps or untold places of scripture. We can talk more about, is he completely successful at this? But I think there's significant portions where there can be a kind of puzzle fitting together. So during the ages of the sun, again, you have the first age, second, third, and fourth age. In the first age, you have some kind of origin and some kind of fall story. And if you read, again, Morgoth's Ring and the Athrobeth of Fingon and Andreth, the debate between Fingon and Andreth, you see people wrestling with this. There's different accounts even that humans have of their own origins. And I think it does leave room for the biblical account of the human creation and fall. And maybe one of these days we'll do a deep dive into Morgoth's Ring and the Athrobeth. In the second age, you have this Númenor setting near the Valar, near the elves, and near the trees, and even with the trees, but then you have a fall. In the third age, you have the United Kingdom that is near the elves, and there are fewer trees, and you have a fall, but you also have more of a redemption. You have the victory over Sauron, which begins the fourth age. You start off with the United Kingdom with the white tree and the Shire with the golden tree. You have no contact with the elves. And there is a question of, well, what kind of fall stories are there? I think what happens here is there is room for our history including hope for bodily resurrection and union with divine light. That's especially clear if you read the Athribah. And in this timeline, you also have room for an Israel, Jesus' coming, and also the Christian conversion of the Angles, well, and a whole bunch of other people. So once again, what are the significance of the last two trees? You have Aragorn and the white tree, you have Samwise and the golden tree. The white tree represents kingship, wisdom, and healing. And the theme of wisdom and remembrance are especially powerful. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien says, while it still grew there, the elder days were not wholly forgotten in the hearts of the kings. And in the Shire, when Samwise plants the Malorn seed, what happens but this? An air of richness and growth, and a gleam of a beauty beyond that of mortal summers that flicker and pass upon this middle earth. All the children born or begotten in that year, and there were many, were fair to see and strong, and most of them had a rich golden hair that had before been rare among hobbits. So the question now is, I think, for us as readers, what is the legacy of these trees? Do we see them? Well, there, of course, is a story with two other trees that kind of runs in parallel, that not meant to be identical, but meant to be evocative and similar in their function, where we are, I think Tolkien would have us wonder. So the two trees, of course, that I'm referring to are the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the biblical story. So what's the story of people and trees, and what does that have to do with bearing light from an older age? Well, in Eden, you have the Garden of Eden with these two trees, and you have the call to grow in life and grow in the knowledge of good and evil. How? Not by eating from the tree of knowledge, but by putting your back to it in trust, because God is the one to define good and evil. Don't take that power into yourself. Don't take the desire in yourself to do it. Put your back to it in trusting God. You will grow in the knowledge of good and evil by letting him define it, and instead face the tree of life and eat from that tree as you learn about him, love him, trust him, desire more of his life in you. There's a way in which trees represent God. Of course, because if you're someone without power tools, especially, then what is a tree like to you? Well, it's bigger than you. It's older than you. It's more firmly rooted than you, and it can give you life without dying itself. And so trees represent God, and perhaps there's a special way that God invested these trees with certain qualities of himself, because trees mediate something from the transcendent to the immanent, from the heavens to the earth. And trees are a good symbol and good expression of it. As we know, there was Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, corrupted themselves, and so God exiled them and said, mortality is better than you eating from the tree of life while you're in a corrupted state, because that would make your sin immortal. So don't want to do that at least until Jesus comes. And that began another cycle of stories. The main story was Israel. God brings Israel back into the garden land, and there's these motifs of trees, life, knowledge, and light. So in Psalm 1, the wise and godly person is like a tree. Isaiah 61, verse 3 also says, you will be like oaks of righteousness. What's clear is that we are also meant to have the qualities of trees, long life, and being able to provide shade for others, give fruit to others, be fruitful for others, stand as a symbol of memory for others. There's ways that trees serve as knowledge of good and evil. Like, unfortunately, rebellious sons are hung on trees in Deuteronomy 21 and then 2 Samuel 18. Of course, that's that segment of the story. In the bigger picture, then, there are multiple falls that Israel has into sin because of the sin sickness, and they also go into exile. But remember, there's been this Moses ascending the mountain and God making his face shine with light. Then there's the age of Jesus, where Jesus fills to the full the earlier stories. And it's interesting that he is surrounded by tree motifs. So they correspond with knowledge and life. Knowledge is seen in John 3, where Jesus refers to the story where Moses put the bronze serpent on the pole for judgment. That was a sign of the sin of complaining. And generally, it was the sign of a sin sickness in us that still needed to be cured. And the way to cure it was to put it on the pole for judgment. And if you looked to it, then the Israelites were healed. So Jesus says, that's like me going to the cross, because human nature has been poisoned. It needs to be judged out. And human nature, I need to bring back human nature on the other side of that judgment, cleansed and healed. And so Jesus also is associated with life, the tree of life. He's the truly human one and breathed life into us. In John 19, Pontius Pilate says, "Behold the man." That's after multiple allusions to the Genesis creation story, where man is created. Jesus is the human one. Jesus is also surrounded by garden motifs. So in John 18, he comes out of a garden in order to give his life out of death from a garden. The bracketing of the death and resurrection by gardens is so significant. Irenaeus of Lyon reflects on this and says, "And the sin that was wrought through the tree was undone by the obedience of the tree, obedience to God, whereby the Son of Man was nailed to the tree, destroying the knowledge of evil and bringing in and conferring the knowledge of good. So by the obedience, whereby he obeyed unto death, hanging on the tree, he undid the old disobedience wrought in the tree." Just a poetic statement that he sees the symmetry. And then in the new heavens and new earth, there are also people and trees that are connected to knowledge and life. And so, of course, Jesus' teaching is like a sword, depicted by a sword coming out of his mouth, because it pierces and cuts. And his human nature is purified by divine fire and light. And so there's a knowledge motif. He is also called the living one in that very passage, Revelation 1, 17 and 18. And of course, Jesus is then the fiery sword that guards the way back to the garden, the original garden with the tree of life, and the motifs of the healing of the nations and the garden city of light fall into place. This is Revelation 21. "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And in the spirit, he carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." Notice the mountaintops motif. It has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It has a great high wall with 12 gates. The wall is built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass. By the way, pure gold is not transparent as glass. I think what is being talked about there is refinement. Pure gold is only purified through the fire, and glass is only made clear by going through the fire. So again, this speaks of having encountered Jesus as the purifying one. The foundations of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel, and the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine up on it, for the glory of God is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light. Its gates will never be shut, and there will be no night there. And then in chapter 22, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations." Oh, so beautiful. So it's a garden city filled with light. So it's really powerful that the gates of the city are never shut. So, of course, this leads to this, side question: how does evil then work? Why do people resist Jesus even after this? And again, there is an addiction model of sin, which Tolkien is working with. Irenaeus comments on this, and he's trying to explain why it is that even though the gates are open, there might be some who refuse to come in. Nor does the light fail because of those who have blinded themselves. Notice, blinded themselves. But while it remains the same as ever, those who are thus blinded are involved in darkness through their own fault. The light does never enslave anyone by necessity, nor again does God exercise compulsion upon anyone unwilling to accept the exercise of his skill. Those persons, therefore, who have apostatized from the light given by the Father and transgressed the law of liberty have done so through their own fault, since they have been created free agents and possessed of power over themselves. In other words, well, humans are human beings and human becomings. That is part of our nature. So the condition of our eyes, that's up to us. The light is not the cause of such an unhappy condition of existence to them. So those who fly from the eternal light of God, which contains in itself all good things, are themselves the cause to themselves of their inhabiting eternal darkness, destitute of all good things, having become to themselves the cause of their consignment to an abode of that nature. I think I have one more quote here. Communion with God is life and light, and the enjoyment of all the benefits which he has in store. But separation from light is darkness, and separation from God consists in the loss of all the benefits which he has in store. Not a physical distancing from God. So it's a loss of qualities that we were made to participate in. God, however, does not punish them immediately of himself, but that punishment falls upon them because they are destitute of all that is good. It is in this matter, just as occurs in the case of a flood of light. Those who have blinded themselves or have been blinded by others are forever deprived of the enjoyment of light. It is not, however, that the light has inflicted upon them the penalty of blindness, but it is that the blindness itself has brought calamity upon them. So it's a serious thing. Now back to Tolkien. How is it that trees and light then go together? Well, let's take a preliminary case of the Ents. This is the description of Treebeard. These deep eyes were now surveying them, slow and solemn, but very penetrating. They were brown, shot with a green light. That's what Merry and Pippin noticed, that there's a green light in their eye, in his eyes. Often afterwards, Pippin tried to describe his first impression of them. Notice how Tolkien has us linger on the light of the Ents. One felt as if there was an enormous well behind them, filled up with ages of memory and long, slow, steady thinking. But their surface was sparkling with the present, like sun shimmering on the outer leaves of a vast tree, or on the ripples of a very deep lake. Notice, Ents are connected with memory, and light is connected with memory. True memories are light-bearing. They produce a light-bearing quality for us. It's even interesting that Treebeard says that Ents impart their qualities to trees, just as somehow trees impart their qualities to Ents, or maybe Ents just become like the trees. Some of us are still true Ents, but many are growing sleepy, going tree-ish, as you might say. So they're a little slower. they slow down, but they seem to give their life to others, and that's what the Huorns are, the trees that came alive and fought against the orcs. Most of the trees are just trees, of course, but many are half awake. Some are quite wide awake, and a few are, getting Entish. Fascinating. I think there's a literary allusion to the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus says in Mark 8, or rather, a blind man, blind from birth, healed by Jesus, is asked, what does he see? And he's healed in two stages. And he says, I see men like trees walking. That's the first stage of his healing. And you could look at the context and think about, what does it mean that Jesus heals in 2 stages? So if ants are a kind of less object lesson or a preliminary example of what it means to share in the life of those around you and impart that life, then what does it mean that humans are also light bearers? Again, Aragorn was ennobled through struggle. Frodo was ennobled through struggle. Through their struggle to hope, to be faithful, to share in the victory of good over evil, to resist temptation, they are given a share in the light. The light shines through them. What is that light? I think it's the flame imperishable in Tolkien. It's the secret fire. And as I said before in an earlier session, there's an author named Clyde Kilby who interviewed Tolkien and said very specifically, Tolkien told me that the secret fire sent to burn at the heart of the world in the beginning was the Holy Spirit. So to the extent that Tolkien is creating a mythology, a story that is compatible with the biblical story, then this light that we're called to participate in is the Spirit of God. From there, we look at Jesus as the light bearer. Of course, Jesus is the one who's ultimately ennobled through struggle by the Spirit of God's fiery light. And we see that in at least 4 moments: in his conception, in his anointing, in his transfiguration, and in his resurrection. In his conception, the Spirit comes to make him truly and faithfully human. In his anointing, the Spirit comes to anoint him as king, even though he's in exile and has to struggle with all of the human elements of being chased, pursued, deprived, and tempted. In his transfiguration, the Spirit indicates Jesus's faithfulness is greater than Moses's, and the Spirit is anticipating Jesus's full purification and then ascension/enthronement to be the true light bearer. And in his resurrection, the Spirit indicates Jesus's purification, which is now shared with us. There's a bunch of scripture references that you could chase down here, but I want to share just a few. John the Baptist introduces Jesus and says, he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. Again, that motif of fire is used positively. I know, especially as Protestants, we're used to hearing about fire as a negative. Well, it can be negative depending on whether we resist it. But God intends fire to be purifying, for the light to be in us. And so in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, Paul compares Moses' experience of his face shining with glory to what happens now with Jesus and with us. We are also light bearers. The people of Israel could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside. Thus, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. Not only do we share in the light in our face, we're also able to behold it in others. We have stronger eyes. And in 2 Corinthians 4:6, Paul says, for it is the God who said, light will shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. So if you are reflecting on this, if you are using this series for personal reflection or a small group discussion of some sort, here are some things that I am struck by as I consider the story that Tolkien puts before us and compare it to the biblical story. Number one, how does Jesus fill to the full the stories of Tolkien's light bearers? You can pick your favorite character. It could be Eärendil, it could be Frodo, it could be Galadriel, Aragorn, Sam. Number two, if Aragorn and Frodo shared in the light without seeing the trees, then Eru's desire for elves and men were fulfillable in Middle-earth. If we now live in the fourth age, in Tolkien's mythology, can we share in the light? If so, how? It would seem like the answer is yes, but how? And so think about what light and the trees represent. Number one, memory and story. And number two, hope, fellowship, and integrity. And maybe some other things. So to the extent you want to reflect on memory and story, if the light of the trees reflects the struggle of the Valar against Morgoth, how does remembering and living in that story shape our sharing in the light? Number two, hope, fellowship, and integrity. How does growing in light contrast with becoming wraiths or ghosts or those who live in darkness in Tolkien's Legendarium, or becoming blind in Christian faith? You may want to glance back at the session that was 2 sessions ago, the addictive power of evil, and also consider again the retelling of stories and the salvation and atonement and the defeat of evil by the hero's journey. So I'll leave it there for now. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks so much for continuing on with us.